Hi guys. Tonight we step into a world where shadows cling to everything, where the flicker of gaslight barely cuts through the yellow fog, and where a woman's entire life could unravel with a single whispered rumor. You find yourself standing on a narrow street in Victorian London. The cobblestones slick with rain and something darker. The year is 1862, or perhaps 1875. It hardly matters. The rules were the same for decades. The air smells of coal smoke and horse dung, of rotting vegetables from the market stalls, and the faint, sour tang of the River Thames drifting through the alleyways. Somewhere above you, a window creaks open and a chamber pot empties into the gutter. You step aside just in time. Welcome to the age of respectability. You probably would not last a week here, not because of the filth or the cold, though both would test you, but because in this world, reputation was everything. It was currency, armor, and oxygen all at once. And if you were a woman, your reputation was the thinnest glass. Beautiful when intact, worthless the moment it cracked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it where you are now? Now, dim the lights. Let your breathing slow, and imagine yourself stepping deeper into the fog of a society obsessed with virtue and terrified of scandal. The gaslight above you hisses and sputters, casting a pale yellow glow that barely reaches the ground. These lamps were the pride of Victorian cities, symbols of progress and civilization. Yet they revealed as much as they concealed. In their weak light, you could see just enough to judge, just enough to whisper, just enough to condemn. The Victorians lived in a world of appearances. What you seemed to be mattered far more than what you actually were. A woman could be kind, intelligent, hard-working, and devoted. But if she was seen leaving a man's lodgings after dark, none of that mattered. She was fallen. The word itself tells you everything. Fallen. As if virtue were a high ledge, and women were always teetering on the edge. One misstep away from plunging into darkness. Men, of course, had wider ledges. They could stumble and recover. They could sin in private and repent in public. But a woman who fell rarely climbed back up. Society made sure of that. You walk past a row of narrow townhouses, their windows glowing faintly behind heavy curtains. Inside, families gather around coal fires, children recite Bible verses, and wives pour tea with practiced grace. This is the respectable world. The world everyone aspired to join or desperately clung to. But respectability was expensive. It required the right address, the right clothes, the right friends, and above all, the right reputation. For women of the middle and upper classes, this meant following an exhausting set of unwritten rules. Never be alone with a man who was not your husband or close relative. Never speak too loudly or laugh too freely. Never let your ankles show or your opinions wander. A proper Victorian lady was modest, silent, obedient, and above all, pure. Purity was not just a moral ideal. It was a woman's entire value. A quirky detail historians love to mention is that even medical textbooks of the era treated female virtue as a physical condition, something that could be examined, measured, and diagnosed. Doctors wrote seriously about the health benefits of modesty and the dangers of passionate feelings. To fall from purity was not just a social death, it was framed as a kind of medical catastrophe. The fog thickens around you as you turn into a narrower lane. Here the houses lean closer together, their rooftops almost touching. The smell changes too. Less coal smoke and more cabbage. Less perfume and more sweat. You have crossed an invisible border into a poorer district, where the rules were just as strict, but the consequences even harsher. For working-class women, respectability was a lifeline they could barely afford. A factory girl or a domestic servant had no fortune, no family connections, no dowry to protect her. All she had was her good name. Lose that, and she lost everything. Employers would not hire a woman with a stained reputation. Landlords would not rent to her. Even her own family might turn her away. Terrified that her shame would spread like a disease, historians still debate whether Victorian morality was genuinely believed or simply performed. Some argue that the obsession with respectability was a response to the chaos of industrialization, a way of imposing order on a rapidly changing world. Others suggest it was always about control, particularly control over women's bodies and choices. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Tangled and complicated like the fog itself, you pause beside a street lamp and watch the shadows move. A woman hurries past, her shawl pulled tight, her eyes fixed on the ground. She does not look at you. She does not look at anyone. In this world, a woman alone on the street after dark was already suspect. It did not matter if she was rushing home from a sick relative or picking up medicine for a child. The mere fact of her presence in public, unescorted, after sunset, was enough to raise eyebrows. The Victorians had a phrase for it: a woman of the streets. The words dripped with double meaning. To be on the streets was to be lost, abandoned, outside the protective walls of home and family. And once you were outside, getting back in was nearly impossible. The cruelty of it settles over you like the damp night air. These women did not choose to be outcasts. Most of them stumbled into disgrace through circumstances beyond their control. A broken engagement, a seduction by an employer's son, a moment of loneliness that led to a pregnancy. Even being orphaned or widowed could push a woman toward the margins. Without a man to vouch for her, she was adrift. And a drifting woman, in Victorian eyes, was a dangerous woman. The bells of a distant church begin to chime, low and heavy, counting out the hours. You count along with them. 9, 10, 11. The respectable world is going to bed, locking its doors, drawing its curtains against the night. But out here, in the spaces between the gaslights, another world is waking up. You can hear it in the footsteps echoing off the walls, in the murmur of voices from basement taverns, in the rustle of skirts disappearing around corners. This is the world of the fallen, though they would not call themselves that. They would call themselves survivors. You take a breath, tasting the soot and the dampness on your tongue. The fog swirls around you. Muffling sound, softening edges, turning the city into a dreamscape of shadows. Somewhere a baby cries. Somewhere a man laughs, harsh and too loud. Somewhere a woman sings, her voice thin and wavering, a melody you almost recognize. The song drifts through the mist like a ghost, and for a moment, the whole city seems to hold its breath. This is where our journey begins, not in the grand houses of Mayfair or the gilded ballrooms of high society, but here, in the fog and the gaslight, among the women who slipped through the cracks of respectability and found themselves in a world that offered no mercy. Over the hours ahead, you will walk beside them. You will see the workhouses and the laundries, the penny lodgings and the midnight streets. You will witness their suffering. Yes, but also their resilience. The small kindnesses they showed each other, the daily rituals that kept them human, the flickers of hope that refused to die. For now, let the fog wrap around you like a blanket. Let the distant church bells fade into silence. Let the gaslight guide your steps as you move deeper into the night. The story of the fallen women is not a simple tale of sin and punishment. It is a story of survival, of injustice, of a society that demanded perfection and destroyed those who could not provide it. And it is a story that deserves to be remembered. Softly, gently, as the world around you settles into sleep, the fog has not lifted. If anything, it has grown thicker, curling around your ankles like a cat seeking warmth. You continue walking, your footsteps muffled against the wet cobblestones, and you find yourself wondering how it happened. How did a woman fall? The word suggests a single moment, a dramatic plunge from grace. But the truth was rarely so simple. Most women did not fall. They were pushed, inch by inch, until the ground gave way beneath them. You picture a young woman, perhaps 18 or 19, working as a domestic servant in a respectable household. She rises before dawn to light the fires and scrub the floors. She carries coal up endless flights of stairs, her hands raw and cracked from the cold. She earns perhaps £10 a year, barely enough to keep herself clothed, and she is utterly alone. Her family lives in a village 200 miles away. She sees them once a year, if she is lucky. Her entire world is the house where she works, the narrow bed she shares with another maid, and the fleeting hours of rest between duties. Now imagine the son of the household. He is young, charming, bored. He notices the way she blushes when he speaks to her. He begins leaving small gifts. A ribbon, a penny, a kind word when no one else is listening. She knows she should refuse. She knows the danger, but she is lonely, and he is gentle. And for a few weeks, she allows herself to believe that perhaps he truly cares. The ending writes itself. A pregnancy, a dismissal without references, a closed door and a long walk into the unknown. The son, of course, faces no consequences. His reputation remains spotless. He might even marry well, perhaps to a woman who will never know about the servant girl who vanished one winter morning. This was not a rare story. Historians estimate that thousands of women each year found themselves in exactly this situation: seduced, abandoned, and cast out. The Victorians called it ruin, and the word was accurate in the cruelest sense. A woman without references could not find respectable work. A woman with an illegitimate child was marked forever. Her options narrowed to almost nothing. The workhouse, the streets, or slow starvation in some forgotten corner of the city. You pass a narrow alley and catch a glimpse of movement in the darkness. A woman sits on a doorstep, her head bowed, her thin shawl offering little protection against the cold. You cannot see her face, but you can hear her breathing, slow and heavy, the breath of someone too exhausted to move. She might be resting, she might be waiting for someone, or she might simply have nowhere else to go. The Victorians had very specific ideas about how women fell, and they wrote about it endlessly. Pamphlets, sermons, novels, newspaper editorials. The fallen woman was a favorite subject, examined and dissected with a mixture of fascination and disgust. But here is a curious detail that often gets overlooked. The official story blamed women for their own downfall. They were weak, vain, easily tempted. They lacked moral fiber. Yet the actual evidence told a different tale. Study after study, conducted by Victorian reformers, found that most fallen women had not been seduced by luxury or lured by pleasure. They had been driven by poverty, exploited by employers, or simply caught in circumstances beyond their control. One survey from the 1,850 seconds interviewed hundreds of women in London's streets and found that the majority had entered prostitution after losing their jobs. Many were former domestic servants dismissed without references. Others were factory workers whose wages had been cut below survival level. Some were widows with children to feed and no other source of income. The romantic notion of the fallen woman, the idea of a foolish girl led astray by pretty promises, was largely a myth. The reality was economic. Women fell because they had no safety net, no legal protections, no way to survive outside the narrow path that society had laid out for them. And once they stepped off that path, willingly or not, there was no way back. You think about the weight of that. A single mistake, a single misfortune, and a woman's entire future closed like a door slamming shut. There were no second chances, no forgiveness. A man could gamble away his fortune, drink himself into disgrace, father children with servants and actresses, and still be welcomed in polite society if he had enough money and the right connections. But a woman who had been seen holding hands with the wrong person at the wrong time might as well have been dead. The double standard was so ingrained that most Victorians did not even recognize it as a double standard. They saw it as natural law. Men had appetites. Unfortunate, but understandable. Women were supposed to be the guardians of morality, the angels of the household. When an angel fell, it was her fault alone. She had failed in her sacred duty. The church bells chime again, distant and mournful. You count the strokes without thinking. Midnight. The city is quieter now, though never truly silent. You can still hear the rattle of a carriage on a distant street, the bark of a dog, the faint music spilling from a public house that has not yet closed its doors. The woman on the doorstep has not moved. Perhaps she is asleep. Perhaps she is simply waiting for the night to end. You wonder what brought her here. A broken promise? A lost position? A family that could not or would not help? The paths to ruin were countless. But they all led to the same place. Historians still debate whether Victorian society was uniquely harsh to fallen women or simply more open about its cruelty. Some argue that earlier centuries were just as unforgiving, only without the detailed records. Others suggest that industrialization made things worse, packing millions of people into cities where traditional support networks broke down and anonymity made it easier to abandon the disgraced. What is certain is that the Victorians built an entire system around the concept of the fallen woman. They created institutions to house her, laws to control her, and endless moral frameworks to explain why she deserved her fate. And at the center of it all was a simple, terrible logic. A woman's value lay in her purity. Once that was gone, she was worthless. You stop walking and lean against a damp brick wall, letting the cold seep through your coat. The fog has turned the street lamp above you into a pale halo, its light diffused and dreamlike. You think about all the women who stood in places like this, alone in the dark, trying to figure out what came next. Some of them found ways to survive. They scraped together enough money for a room, found work in the shadowy economy of the city, or stumbled into the arms of reformers who offered shelter in exchange for repentance. But many did not. Many simply disappeared, swallowed by the streets, their names forgotten, their stories never told. A curious fact worth noting is that the Victorians kept remarkably detailed records of their fallen women, parish registers, workhouse admission books, hospital records, court documents. Researchers today can trace individual lives through these archives, following women from birth to ruin to whatever came after. Some of these records are heartbreaking in their brevity. A name, an age, a cause of admission, seduced and abandoned, pregnant and destitute, found wandering. The language is clinical, almost bureaucratic. But behind each entry is a human being who once had hopes and dreams and a future that did not include standing in a workhouse queue. You push yourself off the wall and continue walking. The night is not getting any warmer, but you are getting used to it. The cold becomes a companion, a constant presence that sharpens your senses and keeps you alert. You pass a row of dark shop fronts, their windows shuttered against the night. A cat watches you from a doorway, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. Somewhere ahead, you can hear water dripping, a broken gutter, or perhaps a fountain that no one has bothered to repair. The sound is rhythmic, almost soothing, a counterpoint to the silence. You think about the women who walked these streets before you, and the ones who will walk them after. The fallen women of Victorian England were not monsters or saints. They were ordinary people caught in an extraordinary system of judgment and punishment. They made mistakes, yes, but so did everyone. The difference was that their mistakes were unforgivable, while the mistakes of others were quietly overlooked. That was the true cruelty of the age, not the poverty, not the disease, not even the endless moralizing, but the simple fact that some people were allowed to be human and others were not. The fog swirls around you, and you let it carry you forward into the night. There is more to see, more to understand. The workhouses and the laundries are waiting. The streets after dark hold their secrets. But for now, you walk in silence, thinking about what it meant to fall in a world that offered no soft landing. The cobblestones are cold beneath your feet, and the gaslight flickers above. And somewhere in the distance, a woman is singing a song you almost remember. The song fades into the mist, and you find yourself standing before a building that seems to swallow the light around it. It rises from the street like a grey cliff, its windows small and barred, its walls stained with decades of soot and rain. A single lamp burns above the entrance, illuminating words carved into stone. You squint through the fog and make out the letters. Union Workhouse. The words send a chill through you that has nothing to do with the cold. You have arrived at one of the most feared institutions in Victorian England. The workhouse was not designed to be cruel, at least. That is what its architects claimed. It was meant to be a safety net, a place where the destitute could find shelter and food when all other options had failed. But the Victorians believed deeply in a principle they called less eligibility. The idea was simple and brutal. Life inside the workhouse must be worse than the worst life outside it. Otherwise, people might actually want to enter, and that would never do. So the workhouses were built to be miserable. The food was bland and insufficient. The work was grueling and pointless. The rules were strict and the punishments harsh. Every aspect of daily life was designed to remind inmates that they had failed, that they were a burden on society, and that they should be grateful for even this meager charity. You push open the heavy wooden door and step inside. The smell hits you immediately. A thick mixture of lye soap, boiled cabbage, and unwashed bodies. The corridor stretches ahead of you, lit by a few sputtering gas jets that cast more shadow than light. The walls are whitewashed but yellowing, the floor worn smooth by thousands of shuffling feet. You can hear sounds echoing from deeper within the building. The clatter of wooden bowls, the murmur of voices kept deliberately low, the rhythmic scrape of something being cleaned or scraped or beaten into submission. This is where fallen women came when they had nowhere else to go. The workhouse did not distinguish between different types of poverty. The elderly, the sick, the orphaned, and the disgraced all entered through the same door. But fallen women occupied a special place in the hierarchy of shame. They were housed in separate wards, kept apart from the respectable poor, as if their moral contamination might spread through proximity. Pregnant women were particularly visible, their swollen bellies marking them as sinners in a way that could not be hidden or denied. They worked alongside other inmates, but everyone knew why they were there. The matrons knew, the other women knew, even the children knew. Shame was the true currency of the workhouse, and fallen women were expected to pay it in full. You walk deeper into the building, your footsteps echoing off the bare walls. A door opens to your left, and you catch a glimpse of a long room filled with women sitting in rows. They are picking oakum, a task so common in Victorian workhouses that it became synonymous with poverty itself. Oakum was old rope, tarred and salted from years at sea, and the job was to tear it apart into loose fibers that could be used for caulking ships. It sounds simple enough, but the tar made the rope stiff and resistant, and the fibers cut into fingers like tiny knives. After hours of picking, a woman's hands would be raw and bleeding, her fingernails cracked, her palms stained black with tar that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A quirky detail historians often mention is that experienced oakum pickers developed a technique of soaking the rope in their own urine to soften it. The workhouse authorities knew about this and did nothing to stop it. Efficiency mattered more than dignity. You watch the women work in silence. Their faces are blank, their movements mechanical. Some are young, barely more than girls. Others are middle-aged, their bodies bent from years of labor. A few are visibly pregnant, their swollen bellies pressing against the rough fabric of their workhouse uniforms. They do not look up as you pass. They have learned that looking up invites attention, and attention in this place is rarely kind. The uniform itself was part of the punishment. Every inmate wore the same shapeless dress of coarse grey or brown fabric, the same heavy shoes, the same plain cap. All personal belongings were confiscated upon entry. Jewelry, ribbons, even letters from loved ones. The message was clear. You are no longer an individual. You are an inmate, a number, a problem to be managed. For fallen women, the humiliation went even further. In some workhouses, they were required to wear distinctive badges or armbands marking their status. In others, their hair was cut short, a visible sign of disgrace that would take months or years to grow back. The idea was to make the punishment visible, to ensure that even after a woman left the workhouse, she would carry the marks of her time there. Historians still debate whether these practices were universal or varied from place to place. Records suggest that much depended on the individual workhouse master and the local board of guardians who oversaw operations. Some were relatively humane. Others took a grim satisfaction in enforcing every possible indignity. You turn a corner and find yourself in a smaller room. Here the smell is different, sharper, tinged with blood and something medicinal. This is the lying-in ward, where pregnant women came to give birth. The beds are narrow and packed close together, each one holding a woman in some stage of labor or recovery. A midwife moves between them, her face tired, her hands never still. She does not look at you either. She has seen too much to be curious about strangers. Childbirth in the workhouse was a grim affair. There were no private rooms, no comforting family members, no gentle words of encouragement. Women labored in full view of other inmates, their cries echoing off the whitewashed walls. The mortality rate for both mothers and infants was higher here than almost anywhere else in the country. Infections spread easily in the crowded, poorly ventilated wards. Many women entered the workhouse healthy and left it in a coffin. A mainstream historical fact worth remembering is that workhouse births were recorded with brutal efficiency. The registers noted the mother's name, the child's sex, and whether the infant was legitimate or illegitimate. That single word, illegitimate, would follow the child for the rest of its life. It appeared on birth certificates, school records, and employment documents. An illegitimate child could be denied inheritance, barred from certain professions, and subjected to social stigma that persisted well into the 20th century. The sins of the mother, as the Victorians saw it, passed directly to the child. You leave the lying-in ward and climb a narrow staircase to the upper floors. Here the wards are quieter, filled with women who have been in the workhouse for months or even years. Some are elderly, too frail to work, waiting out their final days in this grey institution. Others are younger but broken, their spirits crushed by the endless routine of labour and shame. You pass a woman sitting alone by a small window, her hands idle in her lap. She stares out at the fog, though there is nothing to see. Her face is expressionless, her eyes empty. You wonder how long she has been here. You wonder if she remembers what the world outside looks like. The daily routine of the workhouse was designed to fill every waking hour. Inmates rose at 6 in summer, 7 in winter. They washed in cold water, dressed in their uniforms, and assembled for prayers before a breakfast of thin gruel and bread. Then came the work: oakum picking, stone breaking, bone crushing, laundry, scrubbing, whatever task the workhouse required. Lunch was more gruel, perhaps with a bit of cheese or meat on good days. Dinner was bread and broth. And then, after another round of prayers, the inmates were locked in their wards for the night, forbidden to speak, forbidden to move, forbidden to do anything but lie in the darkness and wait for another day to begin. There is still discussion among historians about how women survived this routine without losing their minds entirely. Some suggest that the very monotony of workhouse life provided a kind of numbness, a protective shell against despair. Others point to the small acts of resistance that inmates practiced: smuggled notes, whispered conversations, tiny gestures of kindness that the authorities could not entirely stamp out. The human spirit, it seems, is remarkably difficult to crush, even in the workhouse. Women found ways to remain human. You descend the staircase slowly, letting your hand trail along the cold stone wall. The fog outside has grown thicker, pressing against the small windows like a living thing. The sounds of the workhouse fade behind you as you approach the entrance, the scraping and clattering giving way to a heavy silence. You pause at the door and look back at the long corridor stretching into shadow. Somewhere in those wards, women are working, sleeping, giving birth, dying. They entered this place because society offered them no other choice, and many of them will never leave. You step back into the night, the cold air filling your lungs like a drink of water after a long thirst. The workhouse looms behind you, its grey walls disappearing into the mist. You think about the women inside, their faces blank, their hands stained with tar, their futures measured in bowls of gruel and hours of labor. This was the first stop for many fallen women, but it was rarely the last. There were other places waiting for them, other institutions designed to contain and control and punish. The Magdalene laundries, the penitentiaries, the streets themselves. The night is still young, and there is so much more to see. You leave the workhouse behind, its grey bulk fading into the fog like a bad dream that refuses to fully dissolve. The streets are quieter now, the midnight hour having chased most respectable citizens indoors. But you are not heading toward respectability. You are walking toward a different kind of institution, one that promised salvation but delivered something far more complicated: the Magdalene laundries. Even the name carries weight, heavy with religious meaning and centuries of judgment. Mary Magdalene, the repentant sinner, the fallen woman who washed the feet of Christ with her tears. The Victorians loved her story. They built entire institutions around it. You turn down a narrow lane and the smell changes. The coal smoke and horse dung give way to something sharper, more chemical. Lye soap and hot water, steam and starch. The scent of endless laundering, of fabric boiled and beaten and scrubbed until it surrendered its stains. Before you see the building, you hear it. The rhythmic slap of wet cloth against stone, the hiss of steam escaping from massive copper vats, the murmur of women's voices, not quite singing, not quite praying, something in between. You have arrived at one of the Magdalene asylums, and the sound of labor greets you like a warning. The building itself is unremarkable from the outside. Red brick, tall windows, a modest cross above the entrance. It could be a school or a hospital or a particularly grim factory. But the women inside knew exactly what it was: a prison dressed in the clothes of charity. The Magdalene laundries were run by religious orders, Catholic and Protestant alike, and they operated on a simple principle. Fallen women could be redeemed through work. Hard, endless, back-breaking work. The logic was almost elegant in its cruelty. Sin had stained these women's souls. Therefore, they would spend their days removing stains from other people's linens. The symbolism was deliberate. Every sheet they scrubbed, every shirt they pressed, every tablecloth they folded was supposed to bring them closer to forgiveness. You step through the entrance and into a world of steam and shadow. The main laundry room stretches before you, longer than you expected, filled with rows of wooden washtubs and massive mangles. Women stand at each station, their sleeves rolled up, their arms red from the hot water and harsh soap. They do not look up as you enter. They have learned that visitors come and go, inspectors and donors and curious clergy. But the work never stops. The work is eternal. A woman near you lifts a heavy sheet from the water, her shoulders straining with the effort. She wrings it out with practiced hands, the muscles in her forearms standing out like cords. Then she carries it to the mangle, feeds it through the massive rollers, and begins turning the handle. The mangle groans and creaks, pressing the water from the fabric in a slow, steady stream. She will do this hundreds of times today. She has done it thousands of times before. A quirky detail that historians find particularly haunting is that many Magdalene laundries were profitable businesses. They took in laundry from hotels, hospitals, wealthy households, and even government institutions. The women who worked there were not paid. Their labor was considered part of their penance, a debt they owed to God and society. The religious orders that ran the laundries kept all the profits, using them to maintain the buildings, feed the inmates, and expand their operations. It was, in essence, a system of unpaid labor justified by moral redemption. Some historians have compared it to slavery. Others argue that the comparison is too simple, that the women technically entered voluntarily. But voluntarily is a complicated word when the alternative is starvation or the streets. You walk between the rows of wash tubs, feeling the steam settle on your skin like a second layer of fog. The heat is oppressive, so different from the cold outside that your body struggles to adjust. Sweat beads on your forehead, trickles down your back. The women around you are drenched, their uniforms clinging to their bodies, their hair plastered to their skulls beneath their plain white caps. They work in silence, or near silence, communicating only in glances and gestures. Speaking was often forbidden during work hours. The nuns who supervised the laundries believed that idle chatter led to idle thoughts, and idle thoughts led back to sin. So the women learned to be quiet. They learned to exist in a world of steam and labor and prayer, their voices reserved for hymns and confessions. The uniforms here are different from the workhouse. Plain grey dresses. Yes, but also white aprons and caps that give the women a strange, almost nun-like appearance. The intention was clear. These women were being remade, stripped of their former identities and molded into something acceptable. Their old clothes were taken upon entry. Their hair was often cut. Their names were sometimes changed, replaced with the names of saints or simply numbers. Mary became Magdalene, became number 47. The erasure was systematic and complete. A woman who entered the Magdalene laundry was supposed to leave her old self at the door and emerge, years later, as someone entirely new. But years later was the problem. You pause beside a woman who looks older than the others, her face lined, her hands gnarled from decades of work. She might be 50, she might be 70. It is impossible to tell. You realize with a slow horror that she has probably been here for most of her life. The Magdalene laundries were not meant to be permanent homes. They were supposed to be way stations, places where fallen women spent a year or two learning domestic skills before being released into respectable service. But the reality was different. Many women entered as teenagers and never left. They grew old within these walls, washing sheets until their bodies gave out, praying for redemption that never quite arrived. Historians still debate why so many women stayed for so long. Some were genuinely committed to their penance, believing that enough labor and prayer would eventually cleanse their souls. Others had nowhere else to go. They had been disowned by their families, forgotten by the world outside. The laundry, grim as it was, at least provided food and shelter, and some women were simply not allowed to leave. The religious orders controlled their fate, deciding when and whether they had been sufficiently reformed. A woman who questioned the rules, who showed signs of her old sinful nature, could find her release delayed indefinitely. The power was entirely one-sided. You climb a narrow staircase to the dormitories above. The sleeping quarters are spare and cold, the walls bare except for crucifixes and images of the Virgin Mary. The beds are narrow cots arranged in long rows, each one identical, each one stripped of any personal touch. The women sleep here after their 14 or 16-hour shifts, their bodies exhausted, their dreams filled with steam and soap. There are no private spaces, no corners where a woman might sit alone and remember who she used to be. Privacy was considered dangerous. Solitude led to reflection, and reflection led to sin. Better to keep the women together, watched, supervised, controlled. A mainstream fact worth remembering. is that the Magdalene laundries operated for far longer than most people realize. They began in the 18th century and continued well into the 20th. The last one in Ireland did not close until 1996. Thousands of women passed through their doors over those centuries, and many of them are buried in unmarked graves on the asylum grounds. Their stories were lost, their names forgotten, their labor erased from the historical record. It is only in recent decades that researchers have begun to uncover the full scope of what happened in these institutions. You descend the stairs and pass through the laundry room one last time. The women are still working, their movements rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The steam rises around them like incense, and the sound of wet cloth slapping stone fills the air like a heartbeat. You think about what it must have been like to spend a lifetime in this room, watching your hands grow red and raw, feeling your back bend under the weight of endless sheets. The Magdalene laundries promised redemption, but what they delivered was labor. Endless, unpaid, unacknowledged labor in service of other people's cleanliness. You step back into the night, the cold air shocking against your steam-damp skin. The fog wraps around you immediately. Familiar now, almost comforting after the oppressive heat of the laundry. You breathe deeply, letting the chill fill your lungs. Behind you, the building continues its work, the sound of the mangles fading into the distance. The women inside will work through the night, through the week, through the years. Some will find their way out eventually, others never will, and the sheets will keep coming. An endless river of dirty linen that no amount of scrubbing can ever truly clean. The fog seems thicker now as you leave the Magdalene laundry behind. The steam from your clothes rises faintly, mingling with the mist until you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. Your feet carry you downward, away from the institutions of reform and redemption, toward the streets themselves. The real streets, the ones that polite society pretended did not exist. Here, in the narrow alleys and shadowed doorways, thousands of women made their living in the oldest trade, not because they wanted to, but because the world had left them no other choice. You turn a corner and the character of the neighborhood changes. The buildings lean closer together, their upper stories almost touching overhead. The gaslights are fewer here, their pale glow barely reaching the ground. The smell shifts too. Less soap and more gin, less steam and more something sour and human. You hear laughter from a public house, harsh and too loud. A door opens somewhere and spills yellow light across the cobblestones before slamming shut again. This is the territory of the night, and its inhabitants are beginning to stir. A woman leans against a lamppost ahead of you, her shawl pulled loose around her shoulders despite the cold. She watches you approach with eyes that have seen too much to be curious. Her dress was once fine, you can tell, but now it hangs limp and stained, mended in places with thread that does not quite match. She might be 25. She might be 40. The streets age women quickly, stealing their youth like a thief in the fog. She does not speak as you pass, but her gaze follows you, measuring, calculating, then dismissing. You are not a customer. You are not a threat. You are nothing to her. Historians estimate that Victorian London alone held somewhere between 8,000 and 80,000 prostitutes at any given time. The numbers varied wildly, depending on who was counting and what they considered prostitution. Some reformers included any woman who had ever exchanged physical affection for money or gifts. Others counted only those who worked the streets full-time. The truth, as always, was complicated. Many women moved in and out of the trade depending on their circumstances. A seamstress whose wages fell short might spend a few nights on the streets to make up the difference. A widow with children might turn to prostitution during the winter months when other work dried up. The line between respectable poverty and fallen womanhood was thin and easily crossed. You pass another woman, this one younger, barely more than a girl. She shivers in a doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. A quirky detail that researchers have uncovered is that many street workers developed elaborate systems of mutual protection. They watched out for violent customers, shared information about safe locations, and sometimes pooled their earnings to rent a single room where they could take turns sleeping. The solidarity of the streets was real, even if society refused to acknowledge it. These women were not isolated sinners. They were a community, bound together by shared hardship and the simple need to survive another night. The accommodations available to street workers were grim beyond imagination. If a woman earned enough, she might rent a bed in a common lodging house, sharing a room with dozens of others. If she earned less, she might pay for a 4-penny coffin, a wooden box barely large enough to lie down in, stacked in rows like shelves in a morgue. And if she earned nothing at all, there were the penny sit-ups. You have heard of these places but never seen one. Tonight, you will. You follow the sound of coughing down a narrow alley and find yourself at a basement entrance. A faded sign above the door reads, "Lodgings." Though the word seems almost cruel, you descend the worn steps and push through a door that barely hangs on its hinges. The smell hits you first. Bodies and breath and something rotten underneath. The room is long and low, lit by a single candle guttering on a shelf, and along both walls, women sit on wooden benches, their bodies slumped forward, their arms draped over a rope that runs the length of the room at chest height. This is a penny sit-up. For 1 penny. A woman can sit here until morning, the rope keeping her from falling to the floor when sleep finally takes her. You stand in the doorway, unable to move. The women do not acknowledge you. They are beyond acknowledgement, beyond shame, beyond almost everything except the simple animal need for rest. Some snore softly, others mutter in their sleep, fragments of dreams or nightmares drifting through the stale air. A few are awake, their eyes open but seeing nothing, waiting for the dawn that will release them back onto the streets. The floor beneath their feet is wet with something you do not want to identify. The walls are black with mold, and yet this place is full. Every seat is taken. There is a waiting list for the privilege of sleeping upright in this basement. A mainstream historical fact that often shocks modern readers is that these lodging houses were legal and regulated. Inspectors visited them, wrote reports about their conditions, and filed those reports away in government offices where they gathered dust. Everyone knew what happened in these places. No one did anything to change it. The Victorians believed in the free market, in the idea that people got what they deserved. If a woman ended up in a penny sit-up, it was because of her own moral failings. The system was not broken. The women were. You back out of the room slowly, the image of those slumped bodies burning itself into your memory. The cold night air feels almost clean after the basement, though you know it carries its own share of soot and sickness. You lean against a wall and breathe deeply, trying to steady yourself. The streets around you continue their quiet commerce, women appearing and disappearing in the fog. Transactions conducted in whispers and shadows. This is the economy of desperation, and it operates by its own brutal logic. There is still debate among historians about how Victorian society could tolerate such obvious suffering while preaching so loudly about morality and virtue. Some argue that the hypocrisy was deliberate, that the existence of fallen women served a purpose. They provided an outlet for male desires while allowing respectable women to remain pure. They were a necessary evil, sacrificed so that the rest of society could maintain its illusions. Others suggest that most Victorians simply did not see. They walked past the penny sit-ups and the street corners without looking, their eyes fixed firmly on the respectable world ahead. You push yourself off the wall and continue walking. The night is not over yet, and there are more streets to travel, more shadows to explore. But something has shifted inside you. The fog no longer feels romantic or mysterious. It feels like a shroud, covering the bodies of women who lived and died in these alleys without anyone noticing. You think about the woman at the lamppost, the girl in the doorway, the sleeping figures draped over their rope. They were someone's daughters once. Some of them were mothers. All of them were human beings, reduced by circumstance and cruelty to this half-life in the shadows. The gaslight flickers above you, and you walk on into the dark. The images from the penny sit-up linger in your mind as you walk. Those slumped bodies and hollow eyes refusing to fade. But now the fog begins to thin slightly, and you notice something unexpected. A small fire burning in a doorway. Two women huddled beside it, their hands stretched toward the flames. One of them is speaking softly, and as you draw closer, you realize she is telling a story. The other woman laughs. A quiet sound, almost startled, as if she had forgotten laughter was possible. You pause in the shadows and watch. This is something the history books rarely mention. The moments of warmth that existed even in the coldest places. The street was brutal. Yes, but it was not only brutal. Within the margins of Victorian society, among the fallen and the forgotten, small kindnesses persisted, like stubborn weeds pushing through cracked stone. Women who had nothing shared what little they possessed. A crust of bread passed from one hand to another. A warning whispered about a dangerous customer. A coat draped over shivering shoulders without expectation of return. These gestures would never appear in official records. No reformer wrote pamphlets about them. No preacher praised them from the pulpit. But they happened, night after night, in the spaces between survival and despair. You step closer to the fire, and the women glance up. They do not seem alarmed. Perhaps they have grown used to strangers appearing from the fog. The older one nods slightly. A greeting so small it might be imagined. Her face is weathered, lined with years of hard living, but her eyes hold something unexpected. Not defeat, something closer to defiance. She has survived this long. She intends to survive longer still. The younger woman beside her cannot be more than 17. Her cheeks are hollow, her dress too thin for the season, but she is smiling faintly at whatever story her companion has been telling. And that smile transforms her face into something almost hopeful. A quirky detail that historians have uncovered through court records and personal testimonies is that street women often formed tight-knit groups for mutual protection. They called each other sisters. Not in the religious sense, but in the sense of shared struggle. These informal families watched over each other's children, nursed each other through illness, and sometimes pooled their earnings to help a member escape to a better situation. One account from the 1860s describes a group of women who collected pennies for months to buy a train ticket for their youngest member, sending her to a distant town where she might start fresh without the weight of her past following her. They never saw her again, but they spoke of her often, their gift of freedom becoming a kind of legend among them. You sit down on the cold step near the fire, close enough to feel its feeble warmth. The older woman does not object. She continues her story. Something about a landlord who slipped on ice and landed in a horse trough. And the younger one laughs again. The sound is soft but genuine. A tiny rebellion against the grimness surrounding them. You realize that this is how they endure. Not through grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but through these small moments of connection, a shared joke, a warm fire, the simple comfort of not being alone. The Victorians who wrote about fallen women rarely captured this side of their lives. They preferred dramatic narratives of sin and redemption, of tearful repentance and grateful rescue. The idea that these women might find joy among themselves, that they might create their own communities and care for each other without the intervention of respectable society, did not fit the official story. Fallen women were supposed to be miserable. Their misery justified the system that condemned them. If they laughed, if they loved, if they helped each other, then perhaps they were not so different from anyone else. And that possibility was too uncomfortable to consider. The fire crackles and pops, sending a small shower of sparks into the night air. You watch them rise and disappear. Tiny points of light, swallowed by the darkness. The younger woman pulls her shawl tighter and leans against her companion, seeking warmth. The older one shifts to accommodate her, a movement so natural it speaks of long practice. They have done this before, countless times, huddling together against the cold while the respectable world sleeps in feather beds behind locked doors. There is tenderness here, real and unforced, existing despite everything the world has done to stamp it out. A mainstream fact worth remembering is that many reformers who worked among fallen women were surprised by what they found. They expected broken creatures, hollow shells waiting to be filled with moral instruction. Instead, they often encountered women of remarkable resilience and sharp intelligence. Some reformers wrote admiringly of their subjects, noting their wit, their resourcefulness, their fierce loyalty to each other. Others were disturbed by these qualities, interpreting them as evidence of deeper corruption. A truly penitent woman, they believed, should be humble and ashamed. A woman who laughed with her friends and looked you in the eye was clearly not penitent enough. You think about what it takes to maintain your humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The workhouse tried to erase individuality through uniforms and rules. The Magdalene laundries demanded endless labor as the price of redemption. The streets offered freedom of a sort, but at the cost of constant danger and grinding poverty. And yet, in all these places, women found ways to remain themselves. They told stories. They shared food. They remembered each other's names when the rest of the world had forgotten them. These acts of resistance were small, almost invisible, but they mattered. They were proof that the human spirit could not be entirely crushed. The older woman finishes her story, and silence settles over the little group. The fire has burned low, its flames reduced to glowing embers. Soon it will go out entirely, and the cold will return in full force. But for now, this moment exists, fragile and precious. Two women and a stranger sharing warmth in a doorway while the fog wraps around them like a blanket. You understand suddenly why these moments are so important. They are not escapes from reality. They are reality, the truest and most human part of it. Everything else, the judgments, the institutions, the endless moralizing, is just noise. The younger woman's eyes have closed, her breathing growing slow and even. She has fallen asleep against her companion's shoulder, trusting enough to let go of consciousness in this dangerous place. The older woman looks down at her with an expression you cannot quite read. Protectiveness, perhaps, or sorrow, or simply the weary affection of someone who has seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. She catches your eye and shrugs slightly, as if to say, "This is how it is. This is how we survive." You rise quietly, not wanting to disturb the sleeping girl. The embers of the fire cast a faint red glow across the doorway, painting the two women in colors of rust and shadow. You nod to the older one. A gesture of thanks, or acknowledgement, or perhaps just farewell. She nods back. No words are necessary. You have witnessed something rare tonight. A glimpse of grace in a graceless world. And as you walk back into the fog, you carry it with you like a small flame cupped in your hands. Fragile but still burning. The warmth of that small fire fades quickly as you walk deeper into the night. The fog has returned in full force. Thick and yellow, pressing against your skin like something alive. Your breath comes in pale clouds that disappear almost instantly into the murk. The streets here are narrower still. The buildings older, their walls leaning at angles that suggest centuries of slow collapse. You are entering the territory where kindness runs out and survival becomes purely mathematical. How many pennies for a bed? How many hours until dawn? How many winters before the body simply gives up? The women who lived on these streets faced enemies beyond poverty and shame. Disease stalked them constantly, invisible but ever present. Syphilis, gonorrhea, tuberculosis, cholera. The names read like a catalogue of Victorian nightmares. And fallen women were exposed to all of them. The customers who sought their services rarely worried about what they might be carrying or leaving behind. Infections spread through the streets like fire through dry wood. And once it took hold, there was little to be done. Hospitals were reluctant to admit prostitutes. Doctors charged fees that street women could never afford. And the remedies available, mercury treatments, harsh purgatives, primitive surgeries, were often worse than the diseases themselves. You pass a woman sitting alone on a step, her body hunched, her breathing labored. Even in the dim light, you can see that something is wrong. Her skin has a greyish pallor, and her eyes are sunk deep into their sockets. She coughs, a wet and rattling sound that seems to come from somewhere far inside her chest. Tuberculosis. Most likely, the White Death. They called it, though there was nothing white about the way it consumed its victims. It ate them from the inside, slowly, relentlessly, until there was nothing left but bone and exhaustion. This woman might have months. She might have weeks. She almost certainly does not have years. A quirky detail that medical historians have noted is that tuberculosis was sometimes romanticized in Victorian literature. Poets wrote about the beautiful pallor it gave to dying heroines, the ethereal quality of their final days. But there was nothing romantic about dying of consumption on the streets of London. The reality was blood-flecked handkerchiefs, night sweats that soaked through thin blankets, and a cough that never stopped until the very end. Fallen women died of tuberculosis at rates far higher than the general population. Their weakened bodies, their poor nutrition, their constant exposure to cold and damp made them perfect hosts for the disease. And when they died alone, in lodging houses and doorways, their bodies carted away to paupers' graves before the sun rose. You walk on, leaving the coughing woman behind. There is nothing you can do for her. There was nothing anyone could do. Not in this time. Not in this place. The fog swallows her form within a few steps, and you are alone again with the sound of your own footsteps, but the image of her stays with you. Another ghost to add to the collection gathering in your mind. The streets are full of such ghosts. Women who flickered briefly through existence, and then vanished without leaving a trace. No headstones mark their graves. No records preserve their names. They simply ceased to be. Disease was not the only killer stalking these alleys. Gin was everywhere, cheap and plentiful, offering a few hours of oblivion in exchange for a few pennies. The Victorians called it Mother's Ruin, and the name was grimly accurate. Alcohol provided temporary escape from cold, hunger, and despair, but it extracted a terrible price. Women who drank heavily aged rapidly, their bodies breaking down, their minds clouding, their ability to earn money diminishing until they could no longer afford even the cheapest lodging. The progression was predictable and pitiless. From the streets to the gin palace, to the workhouse infirmary, to the grave. It rarely took more than a few years. You smell it before you see it. The sharp tang of alcohol cutting through the fog. A gin palace looms ahead, its windows blazing with gaslight, its doors swinging open to release bursts of noise and warmth. Inside, you catch glimpses of bodies pressed together, faces flushed with drink, voices raised in something that might be song or argument. These places were designed to be bright and welcoming, a stark contrast to the grey misery outside. They drew people in with promises of heat and light and forgetfulness, and they kept them coming back until there was nothing left to give. A mainstream historical fact is that gin consumption in Victorian England reached staggering levels among the urban poor. Reformers estimated that some neighbourhoods had one gin shop for every few hundred residents. The drink was often adulterated with dangerous chemicals to increase its potency, and the effects could be devastating. Women who became dependent on gin found themselves trapped in a cycle impossible to escape. They drank to numb the pain of their lives. The drinking made their lives worse, and so they drank more, chasing relief that grew ever more distant. The end came in different forms: liver failure, exposure on a winter night, violence from a customer or a fellow drinker. The streets claimed their bodies, and the fog erased their memories. You turn away from the gin palace and continue walking. The noise fades behind you, replaced by the familiar silence of the fog-bound streets. Your feet are growing numb from the cold, and your lungs ache from breathing the damp air. You think about the women you have seen tonight, the ones clinging to life and the ones already slipping away. Their suffering was not random. It was systematic, built into the very structure of Victorian society. A world that offered women so few choices, that punished any deviation so harshly, that provided so little help to those who stumbled, was a world designed to produce exactly these outcomes. The disease and the gin and the early graves were not accidents. They were consequences. There is still discussion among historians about whether the Victorians understood this connection. Some argue that reformers genuinely believed they were helping when they preached temperance and moral improvement. Others suggest that the moralizing was a way of avoiding harder questions about poverty and inequality. If fallen women died young because of their own sinful choices, then society bore no responsibility. The blame rested entirely on the victims. It was a convenient theology, one that allowed the comfortable classes to sleep soundly in their warm beds while women froze in doorways a few streets away. You stop walking and lean against a cold brick wall. The fog presses close, muffling every sound, isolating you in a small bubble of silence. You think about the woman with tuberculosis, still sitting on that step, still coughing into the darkness. You think about the gin palace, still blazing with false warmth, still claiming its victims one penny glass at a time. You think about all the unmarked graves scattered across London, holding the bones of women whose names no one remembers. The night feels heavier now. weighted with all this invisible death. But the dawn is still hours away, and there are more streets to walk, more stories to witness. You push yourself off the wall and continue into the fog, your footsteps echoing softly against the stones. The fog shifts and thins as you walk, revealing glimpses of the city you had almost forgotten existed. A church spire rises in the distance, its cross barely visible against the grey sky. A cart rattles past, its driver hunched against the cold, not bothering to look at you. The world continues its business, indifferent to the suffering you have witnessed tonight. But now your thoughts turn to something that makes even the streets seem merciful by comparison. The children, the babies born in shadow, brought into a world that had already decided they did not belong. You find yourself standing before a tall iron gate, its bars rusted but still formidable. Beyond it, a large building rises from the fog, institutional and severe. This is a foundling hospital, one of the places where unmarried mothers could leave their infants in the hope of giving them a better life. The hope was often misplaced. These institutions were overwhelmed, underfunded, and governed by the same moral rigidity that shaped everything else in Victorian society. But for a desperate woman with a newborn, she could not feed. They represented the only alternative to watching her child starve. The process of surrendering a baby was designed to be difficult. The Victorians believed that making it easy would encourage immorality. So mothers had to prove their worthiness, demonstrate that this was their first fall from grace, submit to interviews and inspections and moral evaluations. Many were turned away. Their babies were too old. Their stories were not sympathetic enough. The institution was simply full. These women left with their infants still in their arms and nowhere else to go. Some tried again at other institutions. Some turned to darker solutions, and some simply disappeared into the fog, their fates unknown. You push through the gate and walk toward the entrance. The building is quiet at this hour, but you can imagine the sounds that fill it during the day. Crying infants, shuffling nurses, the scratch of pens recording names and dates and dispositions. Inside these walls, hundreds of children lived in rows of identical cribs, cared for by strangers, waiting for futures that might never arrive. The foundling hospitals tried to find homes for their charges, placing them with foster families in the countryside or apprenticing them to tradespeople when they grew older. But the mortality rate was staggering. Many children died before their first birthday. Victims of disease, malnutrition, or simple neglect. The lucky ones survived. Whether they thrived was another question entirely. A quirky detail that historians have discovered through institutional records is that many foundling hospitals used elaborate token systems to identify their charges. When a mother surrendered her baby, she could leave a small object, a ribbon, a coin, a button, a scrap of fabric, that would serve as identification if she ever returned to reclaim her child. These tokens were carefully preserved, catalogued, and stored. Today, museum collections hold thousands of them, each one a tiny artifact of heartbreak, a mother's last gift to a child she might never see again. The tokens speak of hope against impossible odds, the desperate belief that someday, somehow, the separation would end and the family would be reunited. You stand in the entrance hall, looking at the rows of small beds visible through an open doorway. The children are sleeping, their forms barely visible beneath thin blankets. A nurse moves among them, checking, adjusting, her movements practiced and efficient. She does not look at you. She has work to do, and sentiment is a luxury this place cannot afford. You think about the mothers who walked through this same hall, who handed over their babies and walked back out into the fog. What did they feel? Relief. Perhaps that their children would be fed and sheltered. Grief. Certainly. At the separation. And shame. Always shame. The constant companion of the fallen woman. But the foundling hospitals, grim as they were, represented the better option. The worse option had a name that still chills historians who study this period. Baby farms. These were private establishments, usually run by women, that took in unwanted infants for a fee. The mother paid a lump sum, and the baby farmer agreed to care for the child indefinitely. In theory, this was a form of foster care. In practice, it was often something far darker. The economics were brutal. A baby farmer who actually spent money feeding and clothing her charges would quickly go bankrupt. The profitable approach was to spend as little as possible and hope the infants died quickly. You leave the foundling hospital and walk through streets that grow progressively darker. The buildings here are meaner, the alleys narrower, the smell sharper. Somewhere in this neighborhood, baby farms operated behind closed doors. Their existence, an open secret that authorities were slow to investigate. The infants who entered rarely left alive. They were dosed with opiates to keep them quiet, fed watered-down milk or nothing at all, and left in conditions that guaranteed disease. When they died, their bodies were disposed of quietly, buried in gardens, thrown into rivers, left in parcels on railway platforms. The scale of it was impossible to measure, but reformers estimated that thousands of babies died this way every year. A mainstream historical fact is that several notorious baby farming cases eventually came to trial, shocking Victorian society with their revelations. Women like Margaret Waters and Amelia Dyer were convicted and hanged for the deaths of infants in their care. The trials prompted outrage, demands for reform, new legislation requiring the registration and inspection of baby farms. But the practice continued, driven by the same forces that created it. Unmarried mothers had few options. Respectable society demanded that illegitimate children disappear, and as long as that demand existed, someone would find a way to meet it. You stop walking and close your eyes. The weight of what you have learned presses down on you like the fog itself. The children born to fallen women inherited their mother's shame without having done anything to deserve it. They were marked from birth, their illegitimacy recorded on documents that would follow them throughout their lives. Many never knew their mothers at all. They grew up in institutions, in foster homes, in the streets, carrying a stigma they could not escape. The sins of the mothers, as the Victorians saw it, passed directly to the children. It was a theology of inherited guilt, and it ruined lives for generations. You open your eyes and look up at the sliver of sky visible between the rooftops. The fog is beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly. The first hint that dawn is still possible even in this endless night. You think about the tokens in the foundling hospital. Those small objects left by desperate mothers. A ribbon, a coin, a button. Each one a prayer that somehow, against all odds, love would find a way to survive the cruelty of the world. Most of those prayers went unanswered, but the tokens remain, preserved in glass cases, testifying to hope that refused to die even when everything else had been taken away. You turn and walk back toward the main streets, leaving the baby farms and foundling hospitals behind. The children of fallen women haunt you now, adding their small ghosts to the procession following in your footsteps. But the night is not over yet, and there are more corners of this world to explore. The fog swirls around you, and you walk on into the grey. The grey light of pre-dawn does nothing to warm the air. If anything, the cold seems sharper now, cutting through your coat with renewed determination. You have walked for hours through fog and shadow, witnessing the private sufferings of fallen women. But now you are about to encounter something different, not the hidden cruelties of poverty and abandonment, but the official cruelty of the state itself. The laws that Victorian England created to control and punish women who had strayed from the path of virtue. You are about to witness the Contagious Diseases Acts in action. The year might be 1866, or 1869, or any year during the dark decade when these laws held power. Parliament had passed them with little debate, concerned primarily with the health of military men stationed in port towns and garrison cities. Soldiers and sailors were contracting venereal diseases at alarming rates, and the government decided something must be done. But the something they chose targeted only one half of the equation: the women under the Contagious Diseases Acts. Any woman suspected of being a prostitute could be stopped by police, detained, and subjected to a forced medical examination. If found to be infected, she could be locked in a hospital ward for up to 9 months. The men who visited prostitutes faced no such scrutiny. Their bodies remained their own. Their freedom was never questioned. You find yourself standing outside a police station in a port town, the smell of the sea mixing with the usual urban odors of coal and horse. A woman is being led inside, her arms gripped by 2 officers, her face a mask of humiliation and rage. She is not struggling. She knows it would be pointless. The law is clear, and the law does not care about her dignity. Inside, she will be examined by a doctor, her most intimate parts inspected by a stranger while other strangers watch and take notes. If she refuses, she will be imprisoned. If she submits, she may still be imprisoned, locked away in a lock hospital until the authorities decide she is clean enough to release. A quirky detail that historians find particularly disturbing is that the examinations were conducted with instruments that were rarely sterilized between patients. The speculums used by doctors, made of cold metal and designed without regard for comfort, became objects of terror among the women subjected to them. Some called the examination instrumental rape, and the term was not hyperbole. Women who had committed no crime, who had not even been proven to be prostitutes, could be seized from the street and violated by the state simply because a policeman thought they looked suspicious. The burden of proof was non-existent. A woman's appearance, her neighborhood, her manner of walking, any of these could be enough to condemn her. You follow at a distance as the woman is taken inside. The door closes behind her, cutting off your view, but your imagination fills in what happens next. The cold examination room, the doctor with his instruments, the clerks with their ledgers, the utter powerlessness of a woman reduced to a body to be inspected and catalogued. She might be a prostitute. She might be a factory worker walking home late. She might be a respectable wife whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It did not matter. Once the police decided to detain her, her fate was sealed. The Contagious Diseases Acts operated in 18 designated towns across England and Ireland, most of them military or naval stations. In these areas, women lived under a shadow of constant surveillance. Plain-clothes policemen patrolled the streets, watching for women who fit their notion of what a prostitute looked like. Local gossip and anonymous tips could trigger an investigation. Once a woman was registered as a common prostitute, she was required to submit to regular examinations for the rest of her time in that district. Her name went into official records. Her movements were tracked. She became In effect, the property of the state. A mainstream historical fact worth remembering is that these laws provoked one of the first major feminist campaigns in British history. Josephine Butler, a middle-class reformer, led the Ladies' National Association in a fierce battle against the Acts. She argued that the laws punished women for sins that men committed equally, that they violated basic principles of justice, and that they treated female bodies as objects to be regulated rather than persons to be respected. Her campaign was controversial. Respectable women were not supposed to speak publicly about such matters. But Butler persisted, giving speeches, writing pamphlets, and organizing protests that eventually helped bring the Acts down. You walk away from the police station, the image of that woman's face still burning in your mind. The fog has lifted slightly, revealing more of the town around you. Sailors stumble past, drunk and laughing. A merchant argues with a carter over damaged goods. Life continues, indifferent to the small tragedy unfolding behind those official doors. The Contagious Diseases Acts were designed to protect men from the consequences of their own behavior. They placed the entire burden of disease prevention on women, as if infection were something women did to men rather than something passed between them. The logic was twisted but consistent with everything else you have seen tonight. Women were responsible for male sin. Women must be controlled so that men could sin freely. The lock hospitals where infected women were confined were grim places, though perhaps less brutal than the workhouses or Magdalene laundries. The women received medical treatment, such as it was, and were expected to rest and recover. But they were also subjected to religious instruction, moral lectures, and the constant reminder that their illness was punishment for their fallen state. Some women spent months in these wards, isolated from the outside world, watching their bodies heal while their spirits withered. When they were finally released, they returned to the same streets, the same poverty, the same impossible choices that had led them there in the first place. There is still debate among historians about whether the Contagious Diseases Acts achieved their stated purpose. Some evidence suggests that venereal disease rates declined slightly in the designated towns. Other studies argue that the statistics were manipulated, that women simply avoided seeking treatment for fear of being registered. What is not debated is the human cost. Thousands of women were subjected to forced examinations. Hundreds were imprisoned in lock hospitals, and countless others lived in fear, avoiding public spaces, hiding from police. Their already precarious lives made even more dangerous by laws supposedly designed to protect public health. You find a bench near the harbor and sit down, letting the cold seep into your bones. The sea stretches before you, grey and restless, its waves catching the first pale light of the approaching dawn. You think about the woman in the police station, about all the women whose bodies were treated as public property, whose dignity was sacrificed on the altar of male convenience. The Contagious Diseases Acts were eventually repealed in 1886, thanks largely to Butler and her allies. But the attitudes that created them persisted long after the laws themselves were gone. The idea that women's bodies could be regulated, inspected, controlled by the state did not disappear. It simply found new forms, new justifications, new victims. You rise from the bench and turn back toward the town. The dawn is coming. Slow but inevitable, the fog continues to thin, and shapes emerge from the greyness. Buildings and streets, and people beginning their daily routines. But the night's lessons remain with you, heavy and inescapable. The official cruelty you have witnessed was not an aberration. It was policy, debated in Parliament, implemented by police, defended by respectable men who believed they were doing the right thing, and the women who suffered under it had no voice, no vote, no power to change the laws that governed their bodies. They could only endure and wait and hope that someday the world might become less cruel. The dawn has not yet fully arrived, but its promise lingers at the edge of the sky, a thin line of pale gold beneath the heavy grey. You leave the harbour behind and walk back into the city, your footsteps slow and measured. The night has shown you the worst of what Victorian society could do to its fallen women. But now you are about to encounter something more complicated. The reformers, the rescuers, the men and women who believed they could save souls as easily as they saved pennies. Their intentions were often good. Their methods were another matter entirely. You turn down a respectable street. The houses taller and cleaner than the ones you have been passing. Gas lamps still burn here, their light steady and bright. A church rises at the end of the road, its doors open, its windows glowing with candlelight even at this early hour. This is one of the many religious societies dedicated to rescuing fallen women, pulling them from the streets and setting them on the path to redemption. The rescue missions, they called themselves midnight meetings, penitent refuges. The names varied, but the purpose was the same: find the lost sheep and bring them back to the fold. You slip through the church doors and find yourself in a large hall. Rows of wooden pews facing a simple altar. A group of women sits near the front, their heads bowed, their hands clasped. They are dressed in plain clothes. Not quite uniforms, but close enough. A minister stands before them, his voice rising and falling in the cadence of prayer. The words wash over you. Familiar phrases about sin and forgiveness, about the loving arms of God waiting to embrace those who repent. The women murmur responses at the appropriate moments, their voices flat and mechanical. They have heard these words before. They will hear them again. A quirky detail that historians have noted about these rescue missions is that they often operated late at night, sending volunteers into the streets to approach women directly. These midnight meetings were exactly what they sounded like. Well-dressed reformers walking into slums and alleyways, offering food, shelter, and salvation to any woman willing to accept. The approach required a particular kind of courage, or perhaps a particular kind of blindness. The reformers genuinely believed they were doing God's work. They could not always see how their charity looked from the other side. A stranger appearing from the fog, offering help that came wrapped in judgment, demanding gratitude for assistance that came with strings attached. You watch the minister finish his prayer and begin a sermon about Mary Magdalene. The story is familiar by now. The repentant sinner who washed Christ's feet with her tears. The minister's voice grows passionate as he describes her transformation, her journey from darkness to light. The women in the pews listen without expression. You wonder how many times they have heard this same sermon, how many times they have been told that their lives before this moment were nothing but sin and shadow. The rescue missions offered a clear narrative. You were lost. Now you are found. Everything before was wrong. Everything after will be right. The simplicity was appealing, but it left no room for complexity. No acknowledgement that many of these women had fallen through no fault of their own. No recognition that the streets, for all their dangers, had also been a place of survival and even community. The price of rescue was repentance. Total, absolute, unquestioning repentance. A woman who wanted shelter had to confess her sins, often publicly. She had to renounce her former life, cut ties with anyone who might remind her of it, and submit to the rules of whatever institution took her in. The reformers called this being born again. The women sometimes called it something else. A different kind of prison, one with prayers instead of bars. But a prison nonetheless. Not all rescue missions were alike. Of course, some were run by genuinely compassionate people who tried to treat their charges with dignity. Others were harsh and punitive, more concerned with breaking spirits than saving souls. A mainstream historical fact is that many famous Victorians involved themselves in rescue work at some point. William Gladstone, who served as Prime Minister 4 times, spent decades walking the streets at night, approaching prostitutes and offering them help. His motives have been debated ever since. Some historians see him as a genuine humanitarian. Others suggest more complicated desires lurked beneath his charity. Charles Dickens helped establish a home for fallen women called Urania Cottage, where the approach was notably more humane than most. The women there were taught practical skills, treated with relative kindness, and encouraged to emigrate to the colonies for a fresh start. But even Dickens' project demanded transformation. The women had to become new people, shedding their old identities like snakeskin. You leave the church and walk along the street, passing houses where respectable families are beginning to stir. Curtains twitch, chimneys start to smoke. The day is coming whether you are ready for it or not. You think about the women in that church, bowing their heads, murmuring their prayers, accepting the narrative of sin and salvation that was offered to them. Some of them probably found genuine comfort in it. The structure of religious life, the daily routines of prayer and work, the promise of forgiveness. These things could provide stability to lives that had known only chaos. But others must have chafed against the constraints, must have wondered why their rescue felt so much like punishment. The reformers who ran these missions operated from a position of absolute moral certainty. They knew what was right. They knew what was wrong. They knew exactly what fallen women needed to do to be saved. This certainty gave them the confidence to approach strangers in dark alleys, to offer help that might easily be refused, to persist in the face of rejection. But it also blinded them to their own limitations. They could not imagine that a woman might have valid reasons for refusing rescue. They could not accept that the streets, for all their dangers, might be preferable to a lifetime of supervised penitence. Choice was not part of their vocabulary. Fallen women had made bad choices. Now they would be guided toward good ones, whether they wanted guidance or not. There is still discussion among historians about how effective these rescue missions actually were. Some studies suggest that only a small percentage of women who entered refuges and penitentiaries successfully transitioned to respectable lives. Many ran away within days or weeks, returning to the streets they knew. Others stayed for years but never fully internalized the lessons they were taught. The missions measured success by attendance at prayers, by compliance with rules, by outward signs of reformation. What happened inside the women's hearts and minds was harder to quantify. Perhaps some were genuinely transformed. Perhaps others simply learned to perform transformation while keeping their true selves hidden. You pause at a corner and look back at the church, its spire rising against the lightening sky. The doors are still open, still welcoming any lost soul who might wander in. The reformers will continue their work today and tomorrow and for decades to come. Their confidence will not waver. Their certainty will not crack. And the women they seek to save will continue to make their own calculations, weighing the costs and benefits of rescue, deciding for themselves what salvation is worth. The fog has almost entirely lifted now, and the city spreads before you in shades of grey and gold. You turn and walk on, leaving the rescue missions behind, carrying their complicated legacy with you into the growing light. The morning light grows stronger as you walk, though the sun itself remains hidden behind a thick layer of cloud. The city is waking now. Carts rumbling through the streets, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, servants hurrying on early errands. You move against the flow of traffic, still traveling deeper into the maze of institutions that Victorian society built to contain its fallen women. The rescue missions offered salvation with strings attached. But for those who accepted the offer, who submitted to the demands of repentance, there was another destination waiting. The penitentiaries, the houses of mercy, places where reformation was not just encouraged but enforced. You find yourself standing before a high brick wall, its surface blank and forbidding. A single gate interrupts the monotony. Heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron. Above the gate, carved letters spell out a name: House of Mercy. The words seem almost cruel in their irony. Mercy, in this context, meant rules and routines, prayers and punishments, years of supervised labor in exchange for a chance at respectability. Women who entered these institutions did so voluntarily, at least in theory, but the alternatives were so grim that voluntarily was a flexible concept. The choice was often between the penitentiary and the streets, between submission and starvation. You pass through the gate and into a courtyard, its cobblestones swept clean, its walls lined with narrow windows. The silence here is striking after the noise of the city outside. No voices raised in argument, no laughter, no crying, just the soft shuffle of feet and the distant murmur of prayer. Women move through the courtyard in pairs, their heads bowed, their hands folded. They wear identical grey dresses, identical white caps, identical expressions of careful blankness. They have learned that showing too much emotion invites attention, and attention in this place is rarely welcome. A quirky detail that historians have uncovered through institutional records is that many penitentiaries assign their inmates new names upon entry. A woman named Sarah might become Patience. A woman named Mary might become Humility. The new names were chosen from lists of virtues, constant reminders of the qualities the women were expected to cultivate. The practice served a double purpose. It reinforced the idea of rebirth, of becoming a new person through repentance, and it erased the old identity, cutting ties with whatever life the woman had lived before. Some women kept their assigned names for the rest of their lives. Others reclaimed their birth names the moment they left. The choice was one of the few they were permitted to make. You walk through the courtyard and into the main building. A long corridor stretching before you. Doors line both sides, each one leading to a different room, a different function. Here is the chapel, where women gathered for prayers 3 times a day. Here is the dining hall, where meals were eaten in silence. Here is the workroom, where nimble fingers stitched and sewed from dawn until dusk. The penitentiaries were designed to keep their inmates busy every waking moment. Idle hands, the Victorians believed, were the devil's workshop, and fallen women had already proven themselves susceptible to temptation. Better to fill their hours with labor and leave no room for dangerous thoughts. The work was usually needlework of some kind: sewing, embroidery, lacework, mending. These were considered appropriate feminine skills, the kind of work that a reformed woman might use to support herself in respectable employment. The penitentiaries sold their inmates products to raise funds, creating a system not unlike the Magdalene laundries. The women worked without wages. Their labor counted as payment for their room and board. Some became genuinely skilled, producing delicate work that fetched good prices in London shops. But the skill belonged to the institution, not to them. When they left, they took nothing but their training and whatever character reference the matron chose to provide. A mainstream historical fact is that the length of stay in these penitentiaries varied enormously. Some women remained for only a few months, completing a basic program of reformation before being placed in domestic service. Others stayed for years, either because they had nowhere else to go or because the authorities deemed them insufficiently reformed. The decision rested entirely with the institution, a woman who questioned the rules, who showed signs of her old sinful nature, who failed to demonstrate proper gratitude, could find her release delayed indefinitely. The system created powerful incentives for performance. Women learned to say the right words, make the right gestures, display the right emotions. Whether they believed any of it was a separate question. You climb a narrow staircase to the dormitories above. The sleeping quarters are spare but clean. Rows of narrow beds covered with white sheets. Each bed has a small trunk at its foot for personal belongings. Though there is little to store, the women own almost nothing. Their old clothes were taken upon entry, replaced with the institutional uniform. Any jewelry, any keepsakes, any reminders of their former lives were confiscated or sent away. The intention was to create a blank slate, a woman stripped of her past and ready to be rewritten. The reality was often loneliness, a profound disconnection from everything and everyone that had once given life meaning. You pause beside a window and look out at the courtyard below. The women are still walking in their careful pairs, their movements synchronized, their faces unreadable. You think about what it must feel like to live like this. Every hour scheduled, every action supervised, every thought potentially suspect. The penitentiaries offered safety. Yes, food and shelter and protection from the dangers of the streets. But they also demanded a kind of death, the death of the old self, the burial of memories and relationships and desires. Some women found peace in the structure, others found only suffocation. There is still debate among historians about whether these institutions actually reformed anyone. The success stories were celebrated. Women who graduated to respectable positions as servants or seamstresses, who married honest men and raised moral children. But the failures were more common and less discussed. Women who ran away before completing the program. Women who completed the program but returned to the streets within months. Women who performed reformation perfectly but never internalized its lessons. Living double lives that fooled everyone but themselves. The penitentiaries measured success by external behavior. What happened inside remained largely invisible. You descend the stairs and make your way back through the corridor. A matron passes you, keys jangling at her waist, her face set in an expression of permanent disapproval. She does not acknowledge you. She has work to do, souls to supervise, reformation to enforce. The women in her care depend on her judgment for everything: their daily routines, their future prospects, their very identities. The power is absolute and largely unchecked. Most matrons were sincere in their desire to help. Some were kind, others were cruel, and the women under their authority had little recourse either way. You step back through the gate and into the street, the noise of the city rushing to fill the silence you leave behind. The House of Mercy stands at your back, its walls still hiding the women within. They will continue their routines today: prayers and needlework and careful silence. Some will eventually leave, reformed or not, to take their chances in the world outside. Others will remain, year after year, until the institution becomes the only home they know. You walk on into the morning light, the weight of their confinement settling into your bones alongside everything else you have witnessed tonight. The morning has fully arrived now. pale sunlight filtering through the clouds, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The city has transformed around you, the nighttime world of fog and shadow giving way to something busier, louder, more ordinary. Shop girls hurry past with parcels. Clerks stride toward their offices. Housewives examine vegetables at market stalls. This is the respectable world, the world that fallen women were supposed to rejoin after their time in penitentiaries and rescue homes. But rejoining was never as simple as it sounded. The past had a way of following, clinging to a woman like the smell of smoke. You find yourself walking through a neighborhood of modest houses, the kind where the middle classes lived their careful lives. Lace curtains hang in every window. Brass doorknobs gleam from recent polishing. The appearance of respectability matters here. Every detail scrutinized by neighbors with nothing better to do. Somewhere behind one of these doors, a former fallen woman is working. She rose before dawn to light the fires and boil the water. She will not rest until long after dark. This is the life that Reformation promised. Domestic service, the chance to disappear into someone else's household and pretend the past never happened. The path from penitentiary to service was well worn. The institutions trained their inmates in the skills that households required. Cooking, cleaning, laundering, sewing. They taught proper deportment, how to address employers, how to move through a house without being noticed. And when a woman was deemed sufficiently reformed, the matron would write letters of reference, vouching for her character, smoothing her way into a position. The reference was everything. Without it, no respectable household would consider hiring a woman with no verifiable history. With it, doors could open, but the doors remained fragile, ready to slam shut at the first hint of scandal. A quirky detail that historians have found in household records is that employers often demanded to know why a servant had no previous references. The penitentiaries developed careful language to explain this gap. She was raised in an institution. She comes from difficult circumstances. She has been thoroughly reformed. The phrases were codes, understood by those who knew what to look for. Some employers accepted women from these backgrounds, seeing them as bargains, workers who would be grateful and obedient because they had no other options. Others refused categorically, unwilling to risk their household's reputation on a woman with a questionable past. You imagine her, this woman working behind one of these lace-curtained windows. She wakes at 5. Earlier in winter, when the fires take longer to catch. She carries coal and water up endless flights of stairs. She scrubs floors until her knees ache and polishes silver until her fingers are black. She eats her meals alone in the kitchen, leftovers from the family's table. She sleeps in an attic room so small she can touch both walls at once. And she does all this while carrying a secret that could destroy her in an instant. One whisper to the wrong person. One former acquaintance spotted on the street. One employer who decides to dig deeper into her history. The fear of discovery was constant. Former fallen women in domestic service lived double lives, performing respectability while hiding everything that came before. They learned to lie smoothly about their pasts, inventing families and histories that would satisfy curious employers. They avoided certain neighborhoods, certain streets, anywhere they might encounter someone from their former life. They watched their words, their expressions, their every gesture, alert for any slip that might betray them. The performance was exhausting. A second job layered on top of the first, and the consequences of failure were absolute. A servant dismissed without a reference was a servant who would never work again. A mainstream historical fact is that domestic service was the largest employer of women in Victorian England. By some estimates, 1 in 3 working women was a servant of some kind. The hierarchy was elaborate, from scullery maids at the bottom to housekeepers at the top, each level with its own duties and privileges. For a former fallen woman, the best she could usually hope for was a position near the bottom, the hardest work and the lowest pay. But even these positions were coveted. They represented stability, a roof over her head, 3 meals a day. They represented a chance, however slim, to build a new life. You walk past a servant's entrance, a narrow door set below street level, and think about all the women who have passed through doors like this. Some thrived, working their way up through the ranks, eventually becoming trusted housekeepers with authority over other servants. Others endured, year after year, neither rising nor falling, simply surviving, and some were discovered. Their pasts caught up with them through gossip or bad luck or simple coincidence. These women vanished from their positions overnight, dismissed without ceremony, their carefully constructed lives collapsing like houses built on sand. There were other paths besides service, though none of them easy. Some women found work in factories, the textile mills and match factories, and countless other industries that chewed through workers and spat them out. The hours were long, the conditions dangerous, the pay barely enough to survive. But factories asked fewer questions than households. They cared about nimble fingers, not moral character. A woman could disappear into the crowd of workers, anonymous among dozens of others, her past buried beneath the noise of machinery. Seamstress work was another option, though a precarious one. The needle trades employed thousands of women, many of them working from home, stitching shirts and dresses for pennies per piece. The work was grueling, the pay pitiful, the competition fierce. A woman could sew 16 hours a day and still not earn enough for rent and food. The term sweated labor came from these trades, work that wrung every drop of value from a human body. Former fallen women often ended up here when service proved impossible, their fingers bleeding, their eyes straining in dim light, their futures measured in seams and stitches. There is still discussion among historians about how many women successfully escaped their pasts through legitimate work. The records are incomplete, tracking failures more carefully than successes. We know about the women who were discovered and dismissed. We know less about the ones who managed to disappear, to build new identities so thoroughly that no one ever learned the truth. Perhaps some of them lived long lives as respected servants or shopkeepers, their secrets carried silently to the grave. Perhaps others were always just one bad day away from exposure, the fear never fully fading, the past never fully dead. You pause at a corner and watch a young servant hurrying past, her arms full of packages, her face flushed from exertion. She does not look at you. She has no time for strangers. Her day is already mapped out in tasks and duties, every hour accounted for, every moment belonging to someone else. You wonder about her story, where she came from, what she left behind, whether the life she lives now is freedom or simply a different kind of cage. The morning light falls across her retreating form, and then she is gone, swallowed by the crowd. Just another anonymous figure in the endless stream of workers that keeps the city running. The sun climbs higher, burning through the last remnants of morning cloud, casting the city in shades of pale gold and grey. You have walked through the night and into the day, witnessing the private sufferings and quiet survivals of fallen women. But now your steps carry you toward a different kind of place, a place where judgment was not whispered but spoken aloud. where punishment was not hidden but proclaimed. The courts, the cold stone halls where Victorian justice dispensed its verdicts with the confidence of absolute certainty. You find yourself standing before a magistrate's court, its facade grimy with soot, its columns chipped and weathered. The doors stand open, and a steady stream of people flows in and out. Lawyers in black robes, clerks with armfuls of documents, families clutching each other's hands, their faces tight with worry, and the accused, men and women alike, some defiant, some broken, all waiting for a stranger in a wig to decide their fate. You join the flow and enter, the smell of dust and old paper filling your nostrils. The corridors are dim despite the hour, lit by windows too high and too dirty to let in much light. You slip into a public gallery overlooking a courtroom and take a seat on a hard wooden bench. Below you, a magistrate presides from an elevated platform, his face stern, his voice carrying the particular boredom of someone who has heard too many stories to find any of them interesting. A woman stands before him, her hands clasped, her head bowed. She is charged with soliciting, the official term for what she did to survive. The evidence is thin. A policeman's testimony that he saw her speaking to men on the street, her own admission that she has no fixed address. It is enough. The magistrate pronounces sentence without hesitation. 3 months hard labor. The woman is led away, her expression unchanged, as if she expected nothing different. A quirky detail that legal historians have documented is that the courts processed cases like this with remarkable speed. A woman arrested in the evening might be tried, convicted, and transported to prison by the following afternoon. There was little pretense of careful deliberation. The system was designed for efficiency, moving bodies through the machinery of justice as quickly as possible. Defense lawyers were rare for women who could not afford them. Character witnesses were rarer still. The magistrate heard the police officer's account, glanced at the accused, and rendered judgment. The whole process might take less than 10 minutes. You watch as another woman is brought forward, this one younger, her face streaked with tears. She is charged with theft. A handkerchief taken from a gentleman's pocket. The gentleman himself is present, a well-fed man in expensive clothes, his expression one of wounded dignity. The woman claims she found the handkerchief on the ground. No one believes her. The magistrate sentences her to 6 months, and she breaks down sobbing as the guards lead her away. The gentleman straightens his coat and leaves the courtroom, already forgetting about the life he has just destroyed. The disparity in how the courts treated men and women was stark and well documented. A man caught visiting a prostitute faced no legal consequences whatsoever. His behavior was considered regrettable but natural, a weakness of the flesh that society chose to overlook. But the woman who provided her services could be arrested, tried, and imprisoned. The transaction required 2 participants, yet only one bore the punishment. Historians still debate whether this reflected genuine moral beliefs or simple convenience. Prosecuting men would have meant prosecuting customers from all levels of society, including the wealthy and powerful. Prosecuting women was easier, safer, less likely to cause uncomfortable complications. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian prisons held enormous numbers of women convicted of minor offences: soliciting, vagrancy, petty theft, drunk and disorderly conduct. The sentences were often short, weeks or months rather than years, but they accumulated. A woman might pass through the prison gates dozens of times over the course of her life, each conviction making it harder to find legitimate work, each release depositing her back on the same streets that had led to her arrest. The system was circular, almost designed to perpetuate itself. Prison did not reform, it simply punished. Over and over, until the body gave out. You lean forward on your bench, watching the procession of cases continue below. A woman charged with being drunk. A woman charged with using obscene language. A woman charged with sleeping in a public place. The offences are trivial. The kind of behaviours that poverty and desperation made inevitable. But the court treats each one with deadly seriousness, as if the social order itself depended on punishing these small transgressions. Perhaps, in the minds of the magistrates, it did. The fallen woman was not just a criminal. She was a symbol of disorder, a reminder that the boundaries of respectability were fragile. She had to be punished not for what she did, but for what she represented. The conditions in women's prisons were grim, though perhaps no worse than other Victorian institutions. The inmates wore uniforms of coarse fabric. They slept in narrow cells, sometimes alone, sometimes crowded together. They worked at picking oakum or turning the crank. Pointless labor designed to fill the hours and exhaust the body. Food was sparse and unappetizing. Discipline was strict, with solitary confinement as the punishment for any infraction. Chaplains visited regularly, offering spiritual guidance, whether it was wanted or not. The combination of physical hardship and moral instruction was supposed to reform, to break old habits and build new ones. The evidence suggests it mostly just broke. There is still discussion among historians about how fallen women experienced the criminal justice system differently from other offenders. Some argue that they were treated with particular harshness, their moral failings compounding whatever specific crime they had committed. Others suggest that the courts showed occasional leniency, recognizing that poverty rather than wickedness drove most of their offences. The truth likely varied from courtroom to courtroom, magistrate to magistrate. Justice in Victorian England was personal, shaped by the prejudices and moods of whoever happened to be presiding. A woman's fate might depend on whether the judge had slept well the night before. You rise from your bench and make your way out of the courtroom, leaving behind the steady rhythm of accusations and sentences. The corridor is still crowded, still filled with the anxious and the accused. You pass a woman sitting alone on a bench, her wrists in manacles, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. She does not look up as you pass. She is beyond looking, beyond hoping, perhaps beyond caring. Soon she will stand before the magistrate. Soon she will hear her sentence. And then the machinery of justice will carry her away. Another body processed. Another case closed. You step out into the daylight and breathe deeply, trying to clear the smell of the courthouse from your lungs. The city continues around you, indifferent to what happens behind those grimy walls. People hurry past on their daily business, barely glancing at the building where lives are decided in 10-minute increments. The courts will continue their work today and tomorrow and for decades to come. The women will keep appearing before the bench, their offences minor, their punishments severe, their futures shrinking with each conviction. You walk on into the afternoon light, the weight of what you have witnessed pressing down on your shoulders like a physical burden. The afternoon light has softened now, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the rooftops. You have witnessed institutions and streets, courts and prisons, the vast machinery that Victorian society built to contain and punish its fallen women. But now you find yourself drawn toward something quieter, something more fragile. The voices of the women themselves, the words they left behind, scratched into margins, folded into letters, whispered into the ears of reformers who occasionally thought to write them down. These fragments are rare and precious. survivors of a world that preferred its fallen women silent. You enter a small archive, a dusty room lined with shelves of yellowed paper. The air smells of age and neglect, of secrets kept too long. A clerk nods as you pass. Accustomed to visitors seeking something in these forgotten files, you find a table in the corner and begin to look through the documents that have been gathered here. Case files from rescue missions, admission records from penitentiaries, letters intercepted by matrons who feared their inmates were communicating with dangerous influences, and occasionally, rarely, words written by the women themselves. Their handwriting is often shaky, their spelling uncertain. Many were barely literate, but their voices come through nonetheless, clear and human and impossible to ignore. One letter catches your attention. It was written by a woman named Ellen, or at least that was the name she used. She was 23 years old when she entered a penitentiary, and she wrote to a sister she had not seen in years. The letter was never sent. The matron deemed it inappropriate, too focused on the past, not sufficiently repentant. But someone saved it, filed it away, and now it sits before you. The ink faded but still legible. Ellen writes about missing her sister's wedding. She writes about a dress she once owned, blue with white ribbons, that she wore to a dance before everything changed. She writes about dreaming of the countryside where they grew up, the smell of hay in summer, the sound of church bells on Sunday morning. She does not write about what brought her to the penitentiary. She does not need to. The absence speaks loudly enough. A quirky detail that historians have noted is that many of these surviving letters focus on small, domestic things. The weather, a meal that reminded them of home, a song heard through a window. The women rarely wrote about their suffering directly. Perhaps it was too large to put into words. Perhaps they knew their letters would be read by others and chose their topics accordingly. But these small details are their own kind of testimony. They reveal women who remained fully human despite everything, who noticed beauty and felt longing and remembered the lives they had lost. The letters refuse the narrative of the fallen woman as a creature defined entirely by her fall. You set Ellen's letter aside and pick up another document. This one, a transcript of an interview conducted by a reformer in the 1870 seconds. The woman being interviewed is identified only by her initials. M.J. She is describing how she came to be on the streets. Her father died when she was 12. Her mother took in washing but could not earn enough. M.J. went into service at 14, worked for 3 years, and then was dismissed when the son of the household got her pregnant. She tried to find other work. No one would hire her. She sold her clothes, her shoes, everything she owned. And then, when there was nothing left to sell, she sold herself. The reformer's questions are probing, sometimes cruel. Did she not feel shame? Did she not know she was sinning? M.J. His answers are patient, almost weary. She knew. She felt. But shame does not fill an empty stomach. Sin does not keep you warm at night. You read more transcripts, more letters, more fragments of lives that history tried to forget. A woman who entered a Magdalene laundry at 16 and was still there at 40. Her entire adult life spent washing other people's sheets. A woman who escaped a penitentiary 3 times, each time recaptured and returned. Her file noting with disapproval that she showed no signs of reformation. A woman who wrote poetry in the margins of her prayer book, verses about birds and freedom and a love she never names. Each document is a window, small and smudged, but offering a glimpse of something real. A mainstream historical fact is that most fallen women left no records at all. They passed through the institutions and the streets without writing anything down. Their stories preserved only in the bureaucratic language of admission forms and court transcripts. The women whose voices survive are exceptional, not because their experiences were unusual, but because someone thought to save their words. For every Ellen whose letter was filed away, there were thousands whose letters were burned or simply never written. The archive you sit in represents a tiny fraction of the lives that were lived. The silence surrounding it is vast. You close the folder and lean back in your chair, letting your eyes rest on the dusty shelves. The afternoon light slants through a high window, catching motes of dust that drift like tiny stars. You think about what it means to have a voice, to leave words behind that someone might read 100 years later. The fallen women of Victorian England were spoken about constantly. Reformers wrote pamphlets about them. Preachers delivered sermons about them. Journalists published exposés about them. But the women themselves were rarely asked what they thought. Their opinions were irrelevant. Their feelings were assumed. They existed as objects of pity or scorn, not as subjects with their own perspectives. The fragments you have read today push back against that silence. They are incomplete, filtered through the institutions that preserved them, shaped by the circumstances in which they were created. But they are real. They carry the weight of individual human experience. Ellen missed her sister. M.J. knew that shame could not fill a stomach. The woman in the Magdalene laundry wrote poetry about birds. These details matter. They remind us that behind every statistic, every case file, every moral judgment, there was a person, someone who dreamed and remembered and hoped, even when hope seemed foolish. There is still debate among historians about how to read these sources. Some argue that they must be treated with caution, that the women may have shaped their words to please their audiences, telling reformers what they wanted to hear. Others insist that even filtered voices are better than no voices at all, that we can read between the lines and find something authentic beneath the performance. You suspect both views are partly true. The women were strategic. They were also sincere. The two things are not mutually exclusive. You gather the documents and return them to their places on the shelves. The clerk nods again as you leave, already forgetting you were there. Outside, the city continues its afternoon bustle, oblivious to the small archive and its fragile treasures. You walk slowly, thinking about Ellen and M.J. and all the others whose words you touched today. Their voices were nearly lost, but they survived. Faint echoes in a world of noise. And as long as someone is willing to listen, they will continue to speak across the years, reminding us that the fallen women of Victorian England were never just statistics. They were people, and they deserved to be heard. The afternoon is fading now, the light turning amber as the sun drops lower in the sky. You have spent hours among the poor and desperate, walking streets where survival was measured in pennies and dignity was a luxury few could afford. But now your steps carry you in a different direction, toward neighborhoods where the houses grow larger, the streets grow quieter, and the curtains grow thicker. Here, behind walls of brick and propriety, another kind of fallen woman lived. The kept woman, the mistress, the one whose fall was cushioned by wealth and softened by discretion. You turn onto a wide avenue lined with townhouses, each one elegant and well-maintained. The brass fittings gleam, the windows sparkle, carriages wait at the curb, their horses stamping impatiently. This is the world of the wealthy, where appearances matter above all else and secrets are kept with religious devotion. Somewhere behind one of these polished doors, A woman lives who would never be seen on the streets you have just left. She has her own rooms, perhaps an entire house. She has servants, dresses, jewels. She wants for nothing material. But she too is fallen. In the eyes of society, she too exists outside the boundaries of respectability. The difference is that her exile comes with comfortable furniture. The kept woman occupied a strange position in Victorian society. She was simultaneously invisible and universally known. Everyone understood that wealthy men maintained mistresses. The practice was ancient, accepted, almost expected among certain classes, but no one spoke of it directly. The mistress herself was a ghost, present everywhere and acknowledged nowhere. She did not attend respectable parties. Her name did not appear in social registers. If she encountered her lover's wife on the street, she would look away, pretending not to exist. Her entire life was built on the foundation of not being seen. A quirky detail that historians have uncovered through letters and memoirs is that some kept women lived in remarkable luxury. Their protectors provided houses in fashionable neighborhoods, allowances that exceeded what most families earned in a year, and access to the finest dressmakers and jewelers in London. These women attended the theatre, dined at expensive restaurants, and traveled to the continent for holidays. From a distance, their lives might have seemed enviable, but the luxury came with conditions. They belonged to their protectors in ways that wives did not. They could be dismissed at any moment, replaced by someone younger or more amusing. Their security depended entirely on the continued interest of a man who owed them nothing. You pause before a particularly handsome townhouse. Its facade painted a fashionable cream, its windows framed by dark green shutters. A woman might live here. You think, a woman with no husband, no family acknowledged publicly, no place in the world except the one her protector has carved out for her. She might be beautiful. She might be clever. She might have come from poverty, her looks and wit her only assets, and climbed to this comfortable perch through careful calculation. Or she might have fallen from a higher place, a respectable woman ruined by scandal who found that wealth offered a softer landing than the streets. The paths to becoming a kept woman were as varied as the women themselves. The economics of being a mistress were complicated but well understood. A woman traded her reputation for security, gambling that her protector's affection would last long enough to establish her future. The smartest ones saved their allowances, invested in property or businesses, and prepared for the day when youth faded and attention wandered. Others lived lavishly, spending everything as it came, trusting that the good times would never end. When they did end, as they always eventually did, the second group found themselves in desperate circumstances. A former mistress with expensive tastes and no savings was a pitiable creature, too proud to return to the streets, too tainted to enter respectable society, suspended in a limbo of faded silk and mounting debts. A mainstream historical fact is that some kept women achieved remarkable success beyond their relationships with wealthy men. Catherine Walters, known as Skittles, was one of the most famous courtesans of the Victorian era. She counted princes and politicians among her admirers, rode horses in Hyde Park to the admiration of crowds, and eventually retired to a comfortable old age funded by careful investments and the lingering generosity of former lovers. But for every Skittles, there were hundreds of women whose names history has forgotten, whose luxury proved temporary, whose falls had second acts far grimmer than their first. You walk on, leaving the elegant townhouse behind. The street curves, revealing more houses, more polished doors, more secrets kept behind heavy curtains. You think about the women inside, the invisible ones, living their comfortable exiles. Their suffering was different from what you witnessed in the workhouses and on the midnight streets. They were not cold or hungry or desperate in the immediate, physical sense, but they were still fallen, still outside the boundaries of the respectable world, still defined by their relationships to men who would never acknowledge them publicly. Their gilded cages were still cages. The hypocrisy of the arrangement was breathtaking but rarely remarked upon. The same society that condemned fallen women, that built workhouses and Magdalene laundries and penitentiaries to contain them, quietly accepted that wealthy men would keep mistresses. The rules were different for those with money. A poor woman who sold herself on the street was a criminal, a moral degenerate, a threat to public order. A wealthy woman who sold herself to a single protector was merely unfortunate, a victim of circumstances, best not discussed in polite company. The transaction was the same, only the price differed. There is still discussion among historians about how kept women understood their own situations. Some clearly saw themselves as survivors, pragmatists who made the best of limited options. They had exchanged one form of dependence for another, trading the uncertainty of the marriage market for the precariousness of a protector's favor. Others seemed to have genuinely loved the men who kept them. Letters and diaries revealing emotions that complicated the simple narrative of transaction. And some surely felt trapped, their comfortable surroundings unable to compensate for the loneliness and shame that came with their position. The kept woman was not a single type, but a category containing multitudes. The sun has nearly set now, the amber light deepening to orange and pink. The wealthy street begins to glow with gaslight from within the houses. Warm yellow rectangles appearing in windows as servants light the evening lamps. Somewhere behind those windows, dinners are being prepared. Children are being put to bed. Respectable families are settling into their respectable routines. And somewhere else, in houses just as fine but with a different kind of silence, kept women are waiting for their protectors to visit, waiting for letters that may or may not come, waiting for a future that remains perpetually uncertain. You turn away from the elegant avenue and begin walking back toward the darker, narrower streets. The contrast is stark, the transition almost violent. One moment you are among wealth and whispered secrets. The next you are back among poverty and public shame. But the women in both places share something essential. They have all been marked by their falls. They all live outside the boundaries that Victorian society drew so carefully around respectability. The kept woman in her townhouse and the prostitute in her penny sit-up are sisters under the skin, separated by money but united by judgment. Neither will ever be fully welcomed back into the respectable world. Neither will ever be allowed to forget what she has been. The sky has darkened to deep purple now, the first stars appearing like scattered salt above the rooftops. You have walked through a full cycle, from night to day and back toward night again. The city around you is settling into its evening rhythms. Shopkeepers closing their doors, families gathering for supper, the respectable world retreating behind curtains and locked gates. But something is different now. Something is shifting. The fog that has followed you all this time seems thinner, less oppressive, and the voices you hear on the streets carry a new note, faint but unmistakable, the sound of people beginning to ask questions. You find yourself standing before a meeting hall, its windows blazing with light, its doors thrown open to the evening air. A crowd has gathered inside, men and women together, their faces animated with something that looks almost like hope. A woman stands at the front of the room, her voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. She is speaking about justice. She is speaking about change. She is speaking about fallen women not as sinners to be saved, but as victims to be defended. You slip inside and take a place near the back, watching history begin to turn. The woman at the podium might be Josephine Butler, or someone inspired by her example. By the 1,870 seconds and 1,880 seconds, a movement was growing. One that dared to challenge the assumptions that had governed Victorian society for generations. The Contagious Diseases Acts had sparked outrage among reformers who saw them for what they were: state-sanctioned assault on women's bodies. But the critique went deeper than any single law. These activists were questioning the entire framework that divided women into pure and fallen, that punished female sexuality while excusing male desire, that built institutions of shame and called them charity. A quirky detail that historians have noted about this reform movement is how shocking it seemed to contemporaries. Respectable women were not supposed to know about prostitution, much less speak about it in public. When Josephine Butler began her campaign, she was denounced as indecent, unwomanly, a threat to public morals. Crowds jeered at her meetings. Hotels refused to accommodate her. She received death threats. But she persisted, and others joined her, forming organizations with names like the Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. The very existence of such groups was revolutionary. Women were claiming the right to speak about matters that had always been controlled by men. You listen as the speaker describes the injustice of laws that punished women while leaving men untouched. Her words are measured but passionate, building a case that seems obvious now but was radical for its time. Why should a woman be imprisoned for soliciting while her customer walks free? Why should police have the power to detain any woman they suspect? Without evidence, without trial? Why should the state treat female bodies as public property to be inspected and regulated? The questions hang in the air, and you can feel the audience leaning forward, hungry for answers that have been too long delayed. The campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts was only one strand of a larger transformation. Writers and journalists were beginning to tell different stories about fallen women, stories that emphasized sympathy rather than judgment. Charles Dickens had been doing this for decades, creating characters like Nancy and Oliver Twist, who were victims of circumstance rather than monsters of depravity. Other authors followed, populating novels with fallen women who were complex, sympathetic, even heroic. The reading public devoured these stories, and slowly, imperceptibly, attitudes began to shift. A mainstream historical fact is that the Contagious Diseases Acts were finally repealed in 1886, a victory that seemed impossible just years before. The campaign had taken nearly 2 decades, consuming the lives of its leaders, testing the endurance of everyone involved. But it succeeded. The laws that had allowed police to detain and examine women at will were struck from the books. It was not the end of injustice, not even close, but it was proof that injustice could be challenged, that systems which seemed permanent could be dismantled, that voices raised in protest could eventually be heard. You step out of the meeting hall and into the evening air, your mind full of what you have witnessed. The street is quieter now, most of the crowd having dispersed to their homes. A few linger in small groups. Continuing conversations begun inside. Their faces are tired but animated, lit by the kind of energy that comes from believing change is possible. You wonder how many of them will live to see the world they are fighting for. You wonder how many will be forgotten, their contributions erased by the passage of time. Reform movements are built on the labor of thousands, but history tends to remember only a handful of names. The shift in public sympathy was gradual and incomplete. Many Victorians continued to believe that fallen women were sinners who deserved their fate. The workhouses and Magdalene laundries did not close overnight. The streets remained dangerous. The courts remained harsh. The gap between wealthy mistresses and destitute prostitutes remained vast. But something had cracked in the facade of moral certainty. Doubt had crept in. Questions were being asked that had never been asked before. And once questions begin, they are difficult to silence. There is still debate among historians about how much actually changed during this period. Some argue that the reform movements achieved mainly symbolic victories, that the underlying conditions of fallen women's lives improved only marginally. Others point to the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts, the gradual softening of rescue mission approaches, the slow expansion of employment options for women, as evidence of real progress. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Change was happening, but it was uneven, contested, and far from complete. You walk slowly through the darkening streets, thinking about the long arc of history, the women you have witnessed tonight, in workhouses and laundries, on streets and in courts, suffered under a system that seemed eternal but proved to be temporary. The moral certainties that condemned them were not natural laws but human inventions, and human inventions can be unmade. The reformers gathering in that meeting hall understood this. They believed that a better world was possible, even if they would not live to see it fully realized. The stars are brighter now, the last traces of daylight fading from the western sky. You can see more of them than before. The fog having lifted almost entirely, the city spreads around you, vast and complicated, full of suffering and hope in equal measure. Somewhere in these streets, women are still struggling, still surviving, still waiting for a justice that has been too long delayed. But somewhere too, people are gathering, organizing, raising their voices against the darkness. The night is not over, but the first pale hints of dawn are beginning to show on the horizon. You think about what it takes to change a world. Not grand gestures or sudden revolutions, but the slow accumulation of small acts. A letter written, a speech delivered, a hand extended to someone in need. The reformers of the Victorian era did not transform society overnight. They chipped away at it, year after year, generation after generation, until the walls began to crumble. Their work is not finished. It may never be finished, but it continues, carried forward by everyone who refuses to accept that cruelty is inevitable. The evening settles around you like a blanket, cool but not cold, dark but not frightening. You have witnessed so much suffering tonight, so much injustice, so much pain, but you have also witnessed resilience, kindness, and the stubborn refusal to surrender hope. The fallen women of Victorian England endured horrors that should never have been inflicted, but they also survived. They helped each other. They left fragments of their voices for future generations to find. And in the end, they helped inspire a movement that began to question everything that had been done to them. The night has fully returned now, but it feels different from the darkness you walked through at the beginning of your journey. The fog is gone, dispersed by some shift in the wind, and the sky above is clear and deep, scattered with stars that seem closer than before. The streets are quieter, the bustle of evening giving way to the hush of late hours. You walk slowly, your footsteps soft against the cobblestones, feeling the weight of everything you have witnessed, settling into your bones like sediment at the bottom of a still pond. You find yourself standing at the edge of a small churchyard, its iron gates standing open. its gravestones pale in the starlight. This is not one of the grand cemeteries where wealthy Victorians built elaborate monuments to their dead. This is a modest place, a parish burial ground where ordinary people were laid to rest. And among them, unmarked and unremembered, lie some of the women whose stories you have followed tonight. The fallen ones, the forgotten ones, the ones whose names were erased by shame and time. You step through the gates and walk among the stones. Some bear inscriptions worn smooth by weather, their letters barely legible. Others have no inscriptions at all, just rough markers indicating that someone lies beneath. The grass is damp with evening dew, and the air smells of earth and growing things. It is peaceful here, far from the noise of the city, far from the institutions and the courts and the midnight streets. Whatever suffering these women endured in life, they have found quiet at last. A quirky detail that historians have discovered is that some parishes kept separate registers for fallen women who died in their boundaries. These registers recorded names, ages, causes of death, but little else. No family members listed, no occupations beyond the euphemisms that everyone understood. The entries are brief and formulaic, bureaucratic acknowledgments that a life had ended, but each entry represents a person who once breathed and hoped and feared, who walked the same streets you have walked tonight, who deserved more than a line in a forgotten ledger. You pause beside a gravestone that has tilted with age, its surface mottled with lichen. The inscription has worn away almost entirely, but you can make out a few letters, perhaps a name, perhaps just the beginning of one. You will never know who lies here. No one will. The knowledge has been lost, dissolved into the earth along with the body it once identified. But you stand here anyway, bearing witness to a life that mattered, even if the world chose to forget it. The women of Victorian England who fell from respectability did not choose their fates. They were pushed by poverty, by exploitation, by a system that offered them no safety net and no second chances. They were judged by standards they had no voice in creating, punished by laws they had no power to change, condemned by a morality that excused in men what it destroyed in women, and yet they survived. They found ways to endure, to help each other, to maintain their humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Their resilience was its own kind of triumph, quiet and unrecognized but real. You think about the women you have encountered tonight, the ones in the workhouse, picking oakum until their fingers bled, the ones in the Magdalene laundries, washing sheets for years that stretched into decades, the ones on the streets, huddled in penny sit-ups or walking the cold cobblestones in search of customers, the ones in the penitentiaries, learning needlework and prayers, the ones in the courts, standing before magistrates who saw them as problems to be processed, the ones in the comfortable townhouses, waiting for protectors who might never come. Each one carried a story, complex and particular, that cannot be reduced to simple categories of sin and redemption. A mainstream historical fact worth remembering is that the treatment of fallen women in Victorian England was not inevitable. Other societies, other times, have organized themselves differently. The harshness of Victorian morality was a choice, made by people who could have chosen otherwise. And the gradual softening of that harshness, the slow emergence of sympathy and reform, was also a choice, made by people who refused to accept that cruelty was necessary. History is not a river flowing in one direction. It is shaped by human hands, and it can be reshaped by human hands. The stars wheel slowly overhead, their ancient light falling on the churchyard and the city beyond. You have been walking for what feels like forever, through fog and darkness and the occasional glimmer of hope. Your body is tired, but your mind is quiet, filled with a strange peace that comes from understanding. The world you have witnessed tonight was harsh beyond measure, but it was also a world where kindness persisted, where women shared their bread and their warmth, where reformers raised their voices against injustice. The darkness was real, but so was the light that pushed against it. You leave the churchyard and walk back toward the city. Your steps slow and unhurried. The streets are nearly empty now, the gas lights burning steadily, casting pools of yellow light on the cobblestones. A cat watches you from a doorway. A night watchman nods as you pass. The city sleeps, its troubles suspended until morning, its dreams hidden behind curtained windows. You feel yourself becoming part of that sleep, your thoughts softening, your body growing heavy with the accumulated weight of the night. There is still so much that remains unresolved. The fallen women of Victorian England never received the justice they deserved. Many of their stories were lost forever, buried in unmarked graves or erased from official records. The systems that oppressed them evolved but did not disappear, taking new forms in new centuries. The work of reform is never finished. But tonight, at least, you have borne witness. You have walked where they walked, seen what they saw, felt something of what they felt. Their ghosts have accompanied you through the fog, and now they can rest. The sky to the east is beginning to lighten, the first faint hint of dawn appearing on the horizon. The stars are fading, their light yielding to the greater light approaching. You find a bench in a small square and sit down, letting your body relax into the wooden slats. The air is cool but gentle, carrying the scent of morning, of dew and distant bread baking, and the river waking from its nightly stillness. The world is about to begin again, as it always does, carrying forward both its burdens and its possibilities. You close your eyes and let the sounds of the city wash over you. A cart rumbling in the distance, a bird beginning its morning song, the soft footsteps of early risers making their way to work. These are the sounds of ordinary life continuing, of survival achieved one more time. The fallen women of Victorian England heard these same sounds, felt this same transition from night to day, drew this same breath of relief at having made it through another darkness. In this small way, across all the years that separate you, you are connected. The bench is hard beneath you, but you do not mind. Your body has carried you through so much tonight, and now it deserves rest. You think of Ellen, missing her sister, of M.J., explaining that shame does not fill a stomach, of the woman by the fire, draping her coat over shivering shoulders, of all the unnamed, uncounted women who lived and suffered and persevered. They are part of you now, woven into your understanding of what it means to be human. Their stories will not be forgotten, not entirely, not as long as someone is willing to remember. The light grows stronger, the sky shifting from grey to pink to pale gold. The fog is gone, the night is ending, and somewhere, in the quiet spaces between waking and sleeping, the fallen women of Victorian England are finally at peace. You let your thoughts drift, soft and formless, carried on the tide of morning. The world turns beneath you, steady and patient, as it has always turned, and sleep comes at last, gentle and welcoming, a gift earned by walking through darkness into light. Rest now. The long night has passed. The stories have been told, And though the world remains imperfect, though injustice still walks the streets, and shame still falls on those who deserve only kindness, there is hope. There has always been hope. It lives in the hands that reach out to help, in the voices that speak against cruelty, in the hearts that refuse to forget. Sleep now, and carry these stories with you into your dreams. The dawn is here. The fog has lifted, and somewhere, across the years, the women you have walked beside tonight are resting too. Sweet dreams.